I used to preach almost an hour every day at high school. I took the bus, so I'd get there and I'd start talking to people in the morning. I generally would go to the cafeteria and just find someone who wasn't on their phone. So I became familiar with many different faces in the school. Not only did the other freshmen know me, but also the seniors. But nonetheless, I always liked to study, so when I would go and preach, I'd try to preach from an informed position. I'd talk to people about the historical evidence or the many different arguments for God. And lots of people liked this. They said it reminded them of a guy named Cliff Connectley. He ran a show where he'd go out to college campuses and debate different college students. This led to moments that could be clipped and put on social media, which garnered millions of views. So when I talked to these kids, they wouldn't point to their favorite philosophical arguments. No, they would point to what Cliff told them. The historical evidence of Jesus became very important. These clips of students getting owned or destroyed in arguments were their gateway into Christian apologetics. And when so many people were telling me about this Cliff guy, I began to go check him out. I noticed that he had a very particular way to argue. He would mostly focus on purpose and morality. He'd bring up very divisive concepts and then oversimplify and attack the other side. One of my favorite examples was when he assumed that if you didn't believe in God, you had to be an extreme nihilist. And it shows when you watch his videos, one of his main talking points is that without a God, there is no objective purpose. He seems to think that this is a bad thing, and he gets that view of bad from the objective moral standards that his God gives them. You see, he would point to the moral argument more than any other. He'd point to an atrocity in human history and say that God was a necessity for this to be morally wrong. He might even bring up a lady from the crowd who suffered greatly. Maybe she was an SA victim, and he uses real examples of real hurting people to show the moral wrongness of the abuser. He's moved past the theoretical, and now the example is staring at your face. What are you going to say to the woman? Are you going to minimize her sufferings for your philosophical position? It seems like his arguments heavily relied on intuitiveness, an emotional bias. You see, us as humans have evolved for survival on this earth, and something that greatly benefits in that is the sense of right or wrong. We feel it very strongly, and it's to our benefit. It helps us survive. Each of us as humans seem to think we have special dignity, but in the sight of evolution, we are simply animals. So who's right on this? Do we rely on emotion or intuition to lead our practical truth? Is it practical or is it objective? All these questions of why get thrown out the window when you're faced with real examples. So when someone says that they don't know they have a purpose for life, to the viewer who's watching on TikTok, it seems absurd. All to say that the modern apologist uses purpose as a means to an end. Not an end to seeking or open-mindedness, but an end to their God. They ignore the depressed person and get caught up in their little echo chamber, one where their intuitive purpose leads their life. It's a sad conclusion because the argument relies on an intuitive feeling, not an observable fact. This is just one example of how modern Christianity views purpose. Purpose should be the end goal, but instead they use it as a means to an end in their arguments. You'd expect it to be highlighted as a beautiful God-given gift, but instead it's viewed as corrupted. I don't want to be redundant, but in arguments they define a purpose from God as objective, yet they treat it like a clay you can mold and shape to whatever convicting point you want to make. They mold it to whatever argument they need to make work in that moment. But these modern apologists didn't come up with this technique. Instead, they got it from their authoritative source. The Bible is not clear on what purpose is, especially for humans. We have verses like in Ecclesiastes that says that fearing God and keeping his commandments is the whole duty of man. Yet later on we get Jesus truly emphasizing loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And then in the doctrine, you see a different story. Most Christians don't care about fearing God or loving him. Rather, they just want to avoid hell. They might even have personified Yahweh to fit their modern view. Yet I'd imagine that if Yahweh was sending you to hell, you wouldn't worship him. But really, imagine God was sending you to hell. I mean, he still has that objective purpose for your life. It's just not what you wanted. I'd imagine that most Christians would say that they still would worship God. They might claim that God would never do such a thing to them, that he keeps his promises. They might claim that when God throws them into hell and they look back with a sense of betrayal, they'll still be shouting their doxology. So that's a real question for anyone to wrestle with. Do you love God, or are you deeply afraid of him? Or perhaps those work very interchangeably, so we can rephrase. Do you love God, or are you deeply afraid of hell? If so, why? Justice is being served to the max. Why are you afraid? I think I know why. Because now God's amazing purpose is not for you, but against you. Because now you're on the other end of God's amazing plan. You're no longer a part of the Israel chosen people, you're an Amalekite, and God's plan is against you. You know, if you're watching this, there's a good chance that you're in the top 1% economically. If you make $36,000 a year, then you are, and you're extremely lucky. You didn't control where you were born. You didn't control what would happen to you in life. It was luck. It was random chance. It's so easy in that position to look at your life and think that God has had a purpose for you. You may have struggles, yes, but you're not starving. You're not choosing between children. God's plan is looking pretty good for you. When you go to evangelical churches, they praise God and they love him and they shame the one who hates him. They speak from an American perspective. They're so sure of who Jesus is because they've had such a nice life. They're ignorant. They haven't seen what it's like out there. They're in their first world country with food, shelter, they might have family, hopefully they have drinking water. They're not in a war zone, they're not out on the streets in a third world country. They are in the top 1%, and God's plan is looking so good in their lives. But to the one who is born in a country without food or water or shelter or family, what do you say then? I'm not talking about the problem of evil. Let's assume that God has a legitimate purpose for these people. What is it? Just to suffer? Just to starve? Just to die from sickness? So many people I know will be so disheartened when they hear that story, but they don't understand who's in charge of it. God has a purpose. He's not incompetent. So why are they starving? Why are they dying? Why are women having to pick between their two sons? Let's not be ignorant here. This isn't some hypothetical. This is real. This is like what Cliff does. He brings the woman up, except it's not a woman, it's what's around you, and you choose to ignore it. The sickness, the starving, the dying, the dehydration, it's all part of God's purpose. Remember, we're not talking about some vague apologetic of a plan. No, we really think that God has an individual purpose for each person. So how do you explain it when a 2-year-old dies of cancer in a third world country? How do you explain when a lion comes and devours not even a human, but a lamb? How do you explain that God was there, watching? He didn't help. He stood there as you took it. Yet what a Christian must do is claim that this is part of God's purpose in their life. And if you object with incompetence, then look how powerful your God is. I won't ever understand this asinine doctrine. There's a nation of women, children, animals, men, brutally suffering, and you sit there and say that God's purpose is being enacted. The Christian might say that God cannot intervene in that. That when they're suffering, he has deep sorrow. He doesn't take joy in the death of the wicked. Rather, he's mournful. And he's so mournful, in fact, that he's given them the gift of love through this free will gift. And that's why he couldn't intervene. It wasn't ignorance, it was the free will, which he created in the specific way he created it. If you don't get it, God is leading with this. Free will didn't have to be this way. Love could have been different. I mean, when you look at this, there's real people suffering. And it seems like the only objection you can make is incompetence, that God couldn't have interfered. which makes a lot of sense when God does interfere. For example, in the book of 1 Samuel. Now go and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. They devoted the city of the Lord by the sword, destroying every living thing in it, men, women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkey. All inhabitants were killed. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Pezerites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. We can get all pedantic about these texts and try to come up with excuses, but nonetheless, it seems like God's purpose for these people was to be destroyed. And if you want to say that God did it for a good reason, like his glory or his righteousness, then grow up. What an insane means to an end. To say that God used the means of this much suffering and death to the end of him feeling good about how good he is. At the end of the day, he'll be showing his wrath and his power on the non-elect, and the elect will bring glory to his name. And at that point, it's done. He has blood on his hands. But he's God. He can do anything. He could go back. He could change. He could make the rules differently. The truth is there's no reason why this all has to be. God, why did you predestine me to destruction? Why do you bring calamity and peace? What's the difference? The elect? The non-elect? Who is to blame for who's elect or non-elect? Is it on the matter of choice, will, fruition, or maybe on him who calls? Truly, if we have no choice in this, then how is that just? It seems that God constantly shows his hatred towards the non-elect. It seems like when people personify Yahweh, the hatred is never towards them, the calamity is never on their family, but on everyone else. That they stand smiling before God, and he's more than gracious to them. But to their neighbor, they are to be put to death. I mean, is that not why it's written? Everyone in it, they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. Not sparing a baby, not sparing a daughter, not sparing a father. Oh, and we can't forget about the animals, of course. It seems like the non-elect have it really, really bad. But I hate to break it to you, it's not only the non-elect. You see, if those same fathers and daughters were the elect chosen people of Israel, God would be saying to them, "But if in spite of this you will not listen to me, then I will walk in contrary to you in fury. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters. I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and their daughters, and everyone shall eat the flesh of his neighbor in the siege and in the distress." It almost seems comical. It's so absurd. He just says everyone. There's no detail. There's no differentiation. God's just furious to everyone who breaks his arbitrary law. And if a child's not busy being eaten by the father, then it might be that his head is being smashed against a rock. Blessed shall he be who takes the little ones and bashes them against the rock. I mean, seriously, these are babies. The context of this verse is that it's a different tribe. These aren't monsters, they're just babies from different areas. Does God genetically have something against these people? How do you respond to this obviously unjust genocide? And to the person who says, "Oh, well, Elias, it's not genocide. If only the baby had faith, then he'd have been saved." Or the one who preaches that that baby will be taken up to heaven. Your views are asinine, they're abhorrent, they're repulsive. Oh my goodness, you need to grow up. And so far we've had everyone dying, the sons being punished for their fathers, the babies being punished for their leadership. This is God's death sentence for where you were born. The most abhorrent example of collective punishment. And it's all here in the perfect love of God. Is this God's purpose? Is this what it means to be prepared for destruction? If so, I mean, you can leave it. It'd have been better if I wasn't born. But if you really think that God has a purpose for all people and that he's enacting it with his great love, then let's look at this. Is this what the love of God looks like? Maybe we should start loving each other like Yahweh does. Maybe for first, I could eat my neighbor's son. Maybe I could brutally kill all 5 of them. But maybe that's too small for me. I could invade another country. We could get the American army and invade Canada. And like God says, spare no one. Surely this would be an example of his love. Surely this would be showing his objective loving purpose. While we're there, we could be happy. We'd bash the babies' heads against the stone and kill everything else, all of the animals, everything we see, we kill, we destroy, because the Lord our God has told us to. But perhaps we disobey. Maybe we leave the women. We feel too bad. I mean, the babies obviously deserve it, but the women? Nah, let's let the American army choose which ones they want. We can maybe have them line up and kill off the non-virgins, then keep the virgins and have the rest of the American army choose which ones are attractive and keep them as his wife. We'll wait 30 days for their menstrual cycle to finish, and then you can conceive. If you don't know what I'm talking about Deuteronomy chapter 21. And it wouldn't have been women, it'd be many girls too. It'd be extremely likely that some of the wives wouldn't even need to wait a month. They haven't had their menstrual period. They're too young. And that's disgusting. Yeah, as it reads, the Lord commanded it. What do you say to those women? I keep telling you this. Is this God's purpose? If you're shouting at the screen, no, Elias, because of free will, then you've missed the point. Who created the free will? Who foreknew? If God is like an author, he is the direct cause of the book. He knows what is happening. He is writing it down. I mean, seriously, imagine I were to take this cube and knock it off the desk. It fell and it crashed into hundreds of pieces. You would blame me. You wouldn't blame the cube. You wouldn't blame the laws of physics. You wouldn't blame the hardness of the floor. You'd blame the cause. Am I the direct cause for it breaking? No, well, the floor is. I'm technically the indirect cause of this action. Yet we all know that I am really the direct cause. And God's the one who hit off the tree, who hit off the world. He foreknew those women. Do you understand that? There didn't have to be a tree in the garden. This is exemplified when we look at heaven. There's no ability to do wrong in heaven, yet we have a true and glorious love of God. We truly know all things, yet there's no evil. There's no reason. Are you sure that your God doesn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked? If God's glorious plan for even one person is any of what is in the Bible, then I don't want a single bit of it. You can hear all of this, yet when you sin tomorrow, you'll feel like Jesus is patting you on your back. Way to go, you'll get it next time. It's like, no, this is Yahweh. I'm surprised he hasn't made you eat your child. I'm surprised he hasn't put you to death or bashed your head against a rock, or maybe sold you into sexual slavery. This is insane. I'm surprised any of this hasn't come, because by the looks of it, it would be, especially with how depraved we are. Yet there's a better explanation. The explanation isn't some pedantic way to think through this for your whole life and try to use any mental gymnastics to get through all of this plain and clear logic. No, you can simply just say that it was made up. That this was not a real objective God with real objective purposes and real objective love, but rather a God made in the image of man. I'm not against the ideas of some God out there, a true clockmaker, one who lets the world tick down and he watches as people make real choices somehow. But that's not what we get. We get a purposeful, self-driven, glory-hungry God. I mean, seriously. Who needs someone like Satan when you have Yahweh? But we can do better. Us as humans can evolve from this. We can grow, we can learn, we can go to higher levels of empathy and knowledge and morality. We can look at the absurdity of this life, the fact that we don't know why we struggle, and laugh at it and try to make the best of it. We don't have to kill our neighbor. We don't have to eat our children. We don't have to hurt others. We can be peaceful. So let's do that, but let's not dress it up and call it Christian. If you're going to say that the Bible's the word of God, let's get biblical. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with the wrath and fierce anger, to make a land of desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. I will execute great vengeance on them from wrathful rebukes. Then they will know that I am the Lord, when I lay my vengeance upon them. Let's do better. Let's keep thinking. Let's grow in empathy. Let's grow in knowledge. Let's do that in the form of art. Alright, it's a new day. I finished up recording that whole episode, but my camera died. I record on my phone, so very quickly it can lose battery and lose storage. And it just so happened that I was on 1%. I honestly think this is one of the strongest evidences for total depravity. Man, way to cut that vibe. We were getting into it, but I want to get further into it. Except now we're not going to look at just human value, but I want to talk a little bit more about purpose. So far, we've talked about how the apologists use it. We've talked about disfortunate suffering, people who have vain suffering in their life, and it's given to them by God. They don't know why, except it's part of God's plan. And then I used scripture to show how this really was, how so many people were commanded to go and kill or murder or bash or anything you want. And so far we've talked about so many different kinds of human purpose, how we use it, but I want to hone in on one more point, and this is the purpose of God. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. You can look at it from a humanist perspective. God was made in our image to serve our needs, specifically organization and unity. Another more philosophical way to look at this is to think about the existence of this God. I like to go back before Jesus, before Noah, before the fall, before even light was existent. I want to go back to when it was just Yahweh, outside of time and space. Those things weren't even invented yet. He simply was there, and while this is an insanely mystical idea, we can get some more philosophical roots into it. So far we've used many characteristics of human emotion to show the wrongness of the suffering and the vain purpose of these people's lives. But with God it's different, because he not only knows everything, but he can do everything. That means that before there was even light, God was there and had full choice to do whatever he wanted. There was no framework made on how humans would love God. He didn't require free will for that. He could really do it any way he wanted. So like the book of Proverbs says, God would have created everything according to its purpose, specifically the purpose on which he called it for. You see, if God is really omnipotent, at this point there was no logical contradictions. God could do all things. You see, if God was really out of space and time and he could do anything, there is nothing stopping him. The logical frameworks of a square circle don't stop him, because logic doesn't exist. A number doesn't exist. Mathematics doesn't exist. There's nothing but Yahweh. And when we think of this, we can't imagine him in a black void. There's no blackness. It simply is nothing. There's no way we could understand this. This idea is either so ahead of us or so nonsensical that we just can't even imagine. But in that existence where there's nothing stopping you, nothing preventing you, God still desired, in a way, to create humans, to create light, to create the devil. He made it all for its purpose and for its own reason. So why did God do all that? Lots of Christians give different answers. The main two prominently are for his glory or for love. But both of them come back from God desiring something. He desires love from humans. He desires glory from the elect. Imagining this, we can think of everything coming to its own purpose for God's desire. At the end of the day, the common apologetics for why God would be limited in certain ways don't work. There's no laws of logic. There's no evil yet. So now we're left with a really hard question. God has no bounds which he can't pass, and he's choosing to do things. He has a desire in some way to create humans. So why is that? Why does God desire? As humans, we are supposedly made in the image of God. We are like him. We can look to each other to see an example of who God is in a way. The Bible says that there's corruption to this, but if we have our best example, which is a human and the Bible, let's look to them. The Bible clearly states that God desired to do things. It didn't expand on it, but just simply said that he desired it. And as humans, we can see what it means to desire. Desire is never out of an abundance, but out of a lack. You see, I'm a big card magician, and as a kid I always wanted to perform for people. When I wanted to perform for people, it wasn't because I was already performing. I desired to perform for people because I wasn't performing. I had a desire, but it was only because of a lack of something. In other words, you would never desire to drink water if you weren't thirsty. You wouldn't desire to have things out of an abundance of already having them. You would desire them out of a lack. So when God creates humans, he does that out of a lack of humans. This is no hit on his character until we bring it back to what scripture says, which is that he created all things for its purpose to glorify himself. Glory is showing himself, showing how powerful and his wrath is, as Romans 9 says. And if we follow the basic rules of desire, God is desiring glory not out of an abundance, but out of a lack of glory. It'd make no sense. It'd be like if I had a 52 card deck and desired 52 cards. I already have what I desire. There's no more desire left. There might be a desire for more cards or more drinking, but whenever we desire, it's out of a lack of something. So when God desires glory, it shows that he's lacking in glory. In other words, God's existence is lacking in himself. Just like us, God's existence is one of desire. He desires glory. I mean, what's the main question? Why does God desire glory? What is he lacking? And what does that show of his character? A lot of the Bible presents a God who is perfect and satiated. Not one who lacks glory, but one who has an abundance. In fact, I think a biblical picture would be to say that in his character it's overflowing. That God is showing his character for his own glory. You see, I'll state it very clearly. When we desire, it's because of a lack of what we desire. God desires glory, aka the outward showing of his character. So therefore, God is lacking in something. My point is to show that this God would also be led in desire in this aspect. The scriptures write about a God who desires things like humans. And while Christians will say that God is using simple ways to explain his emotions or his paths, and that he doesn't desire the same way we do out of a lack, we understand from what we see in every form of life that that is the only way of desire. Thomas Aquinas talked about this. He talked about a cup that's full, which you can pour more water into and make it overflow. He said that God's glory is like the overflowing water, and that he desires that because of the human's need for good. But when we push it back to God, before the beginning, we see a very different picture. We don't see a picture of satiation or perfectness, but a glory-driven God, one on which he exists only to fill the need for glory. Whenever you ask, especially Calvinists, why anything happens, they'll eventually come back to God's glory. Some other Christians might come back to love. Either way, we're bringing it back to God's desire. God is lacking, and that's the point. He's done all things for the reason of desire. And I know if you've never pushed it back and you kind of accept infinite regresses, then you have no idea what I'm talking about. But for those who understand what I'm saying, I think it's very clear to them. Before space and time and any rules at all, including the laws of non-contradiction, was a desire for glory or love. The love did not require free will. The laws weren't there. If we're going to say that love requires free will, then what about before the beginning? There was no laws. There was no space. There was no time. It was just Yahweh. The most basic principles of the universe were not there. And if you want to claim that these ideas are objective because they're intrinsic to God's character, then say that about free will. Say that about evil. Say that about the choice of rejection. You either have to say that God is the true author of evil and that all of creation, the invisible laws, embody him fully, or you have to claim or you have to really wrestle with some other convoluted pedantic description. God's existence is one of futility because it's controlled of glory, controlled of desire. He's just like us, which is why we continually say that we are not made in the image of God, but God is made in the image of us. What a human and man-made idea to have God desire things. I'm not coming up with this. It's in the text. Read Romans. Read any part of the Bible. God intervenes. He commands. He intervened into the war and had them kill thousands of innocent people and animals. God intervened with slavery just to say that you can't own a fellow Israelite. God intervened with his chosen people and said that they would eat their children and that he'd rip open the pregnant women. But when we come back to it, God didn't have to make it this way. So why did he? Well, it's for his glory. It's for his futile desire. It's for his pure and holy existence. And it's for his love. When we draw Yahweh back to the framework, before the beginning, we see a glory-hungry monster, not a loving father. The point is not to say that God is evil. In this example, there would be no such thing. Instead, it'd be to point out his futile desire. God is a hedonist to his own nature. What must he do to quench that thirst of blood? Maybe he should sacrifice himself to appease his own wrath. What is this, if not pedantic? We don't see a God who acts like a god. We see a God who acts like an evolved human. We see a God who looks like he's just figuring out his powers. So to summarize our second part of this argument, God had a desire before anything was mandatory. This desire is the purpose for every other action ever taken. This desire is his glory. A self-obsessed, glory-hungry God is not one of freedom, or full powerful, or full knowledge, but one of a slave to his nature. And I think that's a really interesting and strong point to think about. This is just such a vague and unknown idea because it's not an idea. It's not something to think about. The idea of nothing can't be thought up of. The idea of a God in nothing and how he would desire makes no sense. But that's kind of the point, and it takes someone who will really think about it and be intellectually honest. It's so hard to understand, but I really think it demonstrates the man-madeness of this idea. And what it shows, if you accept the argument, is that all things are done with a purposelessness. All things happen because of a desire for glory. The existence of this desire shows a lack of omnipotence because he wants. He doesn't have what he needs. And in that lack of glory, God stands. He will stand there forever. Because when we die, we won't be judged. We won't see him face to face or know the truth fully. We might have an afterlife, we might not, but what's most definitely sure is that the truth is not found in the Bible. This God had any means at all to get to the end, which is his glory, and he chose this path. Look around you. There was no need for evil before the beginning. It was simply his decision. It was him who calls. And that's not me proving the Bible with the Bible. No, you still need to go deal with the other contradictions from before. But it shows a God who's done all of this out of selfish ambition. The most true and extreme terrorist attack, the opposite of a watchmaker. And if anyone is courageous enough to deal with these ideas and wrestle with them, and not just bury your head in the sand, then you're one step closer to seeking truth. Part of seeking truth is doubting if there's truth. The process isn't easy. What's easy is blind submission to an idea. But who knows, if you're stuck on Pascal's wager and you're scared of leaving or thinking about these ideas, then place your bets on God. Place your bets on his real omnipotence. Call out to God, and when you hear nothing, you'll be one step closer to the way, the truth, and the life. This has been Elias and Mr. Jumpy Legs. And beyond all, stay curious.